Israel and Iran and Syria has been steadily escalating over the past months. And now, after last night's exchange of fire on and across the Golan Heights, it could probably be called a shooting war. But how much further might the conflict escalate? And what roles will the U.S. and Russia play? Well, with us in studio is Avi Melamed, the Salisbury Fellow of Intelligence and Middle East Affairs at the Eisenhower Institute, and Raphael, Cohen, a political scientist at the Rand Institute. Rafi, let me start with you just on that question. We saw the White House defending Israel's right of response, but as this conflict escalates between Israel and Iran, what position, what actions should the U.S. be taking?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think it's important to think about how the United States perceives the conflict in Syria, because I think it's somewhat different than in an Israeli context. When an American audience talks about the conflict in Syria, they think about it in a humanitarian term. They think about it as a counterterrorism problem with ISIS. To the extent the defense community thinks about it, they think about it as a Russia problem with Russian expeditionary operations. They don't primarily think about it in the Iranian lens in quite the same way an Israeli audience would. And as a result, I think there's going to be diplomatic support for Israeli strikes against Iranian targets. I'm not quite sure how much more the United States is going to go on that score.
Avi, how much does Israel need the United States? Because the U.S. position on Syria and Iran is very vague. Donald Trump says he wants to fight Iranian expansion and support for terrorism, but he hasn't exactly laid out how he's going to do it.
Well, there are different levels of cooperation between the two, but obviously the United States is enormously important for Israel, strategically speaking, not only a military perspective, but many other perspectives. But in the end of the day, when you look today at the current situation where you have an American administration and an Israeli government that are totally cooperated and are totally tuned in the context of the way they want to deal with the Iranian regime, you can understand that this is basically reflecting a strategic understanding of both administrations of the seriousness of the threat that the Iranians are presenting. What will be exactly the divisiveness of roles between the sides? This is something different. In the end of the day, it's very obvious that today we are facing a new, totally new situation in comparison to the previous administration in the United States, the Obama administration, that basically to a large extent enabled the Iranian expansion.
But that new situation, Rafi, let me put this question to you, also includes an Iran nuclear deal that is up in the air. Do you think that the world, to put it in the diplomatic terms we hear from the White House, or even the Middle East, will be any safer in terms of the Iranian threat without the checks and balances of the nuclear deal?
Yeah, well, I mean, that, I think, really depends on what comes after the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And, you know, this was one of Trump's major campaign promises. He plays really well to his base. But I think as President Trump has realized, during his time in office, some of those deals, getting out of a deal and then getting into a next one, I think that's a little bit harder to push.
Yeah.
Obviously, after last night's encounter, it looks like Israel has mastery over the skies in Syria. But one card the Iranians could play is Hezbollah and its extensive missile arsenal there. They haven't played that card yet. Is that something Israel should be worried about?
Israel generally should be worried about Hezbollah because it's a serious threat, but not now.
Not now. Why not?
I'll tell you why. Hezbollah, to the best of my analysis, doesn't want to be dragged into the current story. Here is an interesting figure from today. El Mayadin, communication media network that is associated with Hezbollah, published so for kind of like a census. I don't know to say if it's a real one or a fake one, it doesn't matter. What they say was that 37% of the Lebanese actually says this is not our game. We wish to have no part in the game that's going on right now in Syria between Israel and Iran. The subtext, Nasrallah, the leader of the Hezbollah, sends a message to the Iranians, keep her out of the picture. Couple of reasons. He now wants to try to start monetize his political achievement in Lebanon. He has to take into consideration...
Following these elections.
Following the elections. He has to take into consideration the position of his major allies. Nabi Berri, the head of Amal movement, Michel Aoun, the president of Lebanon. The last thing they want to see is Lebanon dragged to another war, because such war would be devastating to Lebanon. Lebanon is already a smoking volcano. Hezbollah, in this case, does not want to be part of that. The Iranians know that.
So when we hear the Israeli defense minister today coming out and saying this very sort of grandiose threat, if it rains in Israel, it will pour in Iran, is that hubris or is that a legitimate threat for him to be making?
I think that when you look at what happened last night, it's not hubris. I mean, look, here is something very interesting. How should I say it? Reportedly, last night, Israeli Air Force was using less than his 10% of his attack capacities. I can tell you right now that in Iran, they are trying to assess the huge damage caused, and they have to start to understand what is exactly the proportions here. One thing that the mullah's regime understands today, this morning, is decisively, Israel has a technological and military superiority that the mullah regime has not encountered yet, and they have to start taking it into consideration. Therefore, I think that they are going to reassess their situation, to reevaluate what should be the next move. They have to take into consideration two other major components. The United States, Russia, and European major players are saying to them, back up, enough with that. They have to take it into consideration. And the second thing, there is a growing turmoil inside Iran. They have to take it into consideration as well.
Rafa, you mentioned briefly potential U.S. concerns about Russian influence in Syria. In the classic Cold War conception, that would be a major factor here. Does that matter to the Trump administration? Do they have a care about the extent of Russian influence in Syria?
Well, I don't know Trump qua President Trump. I know the Defense Department does. And the Defense Department looks at Russian actions in Syria, not least of which because, you know, Wagner mercenaries attacked American forces not so long ago.
Right, and in that encounter.
Right, in that encounter, and, you know, the Defense Department cares about that. Now, whether or not, how much that factors into President Trump calculus, that I can't tell you.
Avi, how important is Russia here in terms of what Israel can do? We just asked former Air Force commander of the Tel Nof Air Force Base, Relik Shafir, this. Yeah. What if Russia decides not to stay out of Israel's way in Syria? What then?
Russia is enormously significant. Here is something interesting about Putin. Putin is a very sophisticated player. Here is what he's doing with the Iranians. He wants to be the Iranians to be in Syria strong enough to do the dirty job on the ground without putting singing on the ground, just using his air force. So to that extent, Iran plays very well to the hand of Putin. But on the other hand, he doesn't want Iran to be too much strong in Syria to the point that they will be the one making the decision. Putin holds the keys in Syria as he did so far. He still continues to hold the keys in Syria, and he keeps the Iranian exactly at the same place they want to be. One thing we have to remember, in the end of the day, the strategic interest of Putin and the Iranians in Syria, to a large extent, do not coincide.
So actually, Israeli strikes on Iranian targets in Syria, we're talking about Iran, a close ally of Russia, could be playing right into Russia's hands.
I don't think that Putin was shedding a lot of tears last night.
All right. Clear enough.
Clear. And Rafi, if it would be a shooting war between Israel and Iran, would the U.S. have to get involved to some degree, even if they would if Israel would launch a strike in Iran?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think it would put the United States in a difficult position. It would put President Trump in a difficult position. Because remember, as much as the Iran nuclear deal was a part of his campaign platform, staying out of Middle Eastern wars was another major part of Trump's campaign platform. And the president, so far at least, is pretty consistent about trying to keep to those platforms.
All right. Raphael, Cohen, Avi Melamed.
Very interesting reaction from the Gulf state of Bahrain, which does not have any relations with Israel, for the first time coming to Israel's defense and saying Israel has a right to defend itself.
Yes, not so surprising when you look at the whole picture. Look, the big game today in the region is that the Gulf states are enormously threatened by the Iranians. As far as they are concerned, they are viewing Israel as an enormously strategic asset that could help them in the confrontation with the Iranians. This is one thing generally. The second thing, Bahrain is an interesting Arab Gulf monarchy because it's exceptional. Why is it exceptional? Because it's the only Arab Gulf monarchy where most of the people are Shiite Arabs, but they are ruled by a Sunni dynasty, which is a minority. Bahrain sustained for years an ongoing involvement of the Iranians in the inner affairs of Bahrain. Every other week you hear about another Iranian cell that was exposed in Bahrain. No wonder that Bahrain basically took this position.
All right, Rafi, before we let you go, I just want to look ahead, because all of this, we're talking about just 24 hours between Israel, Syria, and Iran, but this is a much longer-term issue. We've heard again and again that the Iranian problem, so to speak, as Israel frames it, is not going anywhere. Does the United States have a long-term vision for Syria at all?
Well, if it is, I haven't seen it. I mean, I think you can see this where We've waffled on whether or not we're going to continue U.S. force presence in Syria. You know, there's competing interests here, and I'm not quite clear that anyone in the administration has sort of a clear conception of the way forward. Yeah.
You've got to wonder what all those leaders on the other end of the phone think when they don't know a clear strategy and what that means for American foreign policy.